All right, if you would get your Bibles, let's turn to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, we'll be looking at verses 1 through 5 today. This is the Word of God. These are the generations of the sons of Noah: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Targumah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with their own language, by their clans, in their nations. Chapter 10, folks, is called the Table of Nations. It is after the flood, the boats have landed, everybody goes off, and there are 8 now that are told to be fruitful and multiply. Noah and his wife, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. It's time to get busy, as it were. This chapter also is a very remarkable historical document. Even the most hostile critics of the Bible acknowledge that this list of peoples is very important. It's in its historicity and its accuracy. William Albright, he wrote this. He said that the 10th chapter of Genesis stands absolutely alone in ancient literature, without a remote parallel, even among the Greeks, where we find the closest approach to a distribution of peoples in the genealogical framework. The Table of Nations remains an astonishingly accurate document. So it is obvious that the chapter is showing the general expansion of peoples and nations in the world after the flood. Now, here's a few interesting things about this list before we dive into the names. Number one, Moses lists both individuals and nations. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example. This is Genesis 10, verse 4. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Elisha and Tarshish appear to be the names of individuals. However, Kittim and Dodanim, those are nations or people groups. The I am ending is what gives it away. As I've shared with you before, I am or im is a plural ending on the end of Hebrew nouns. So the Kittim are descended presumably from a guy named Kit, and the Dodamine from an individual named Dodan. In addition, although the text does not explicitly say this, number 2, there are most likely nations that are left out. Here on the screen, I have the list of the 7 sons of Japheth. But you'll notice that only 2 of them mention children. And this same pattern continues through the chapter. There are some that it gives the children, even maybe some grandchildren. But then there are some where those sons have listed no descendants at all. Now, it's very likely that people like Tubal and Meshach and Tyrus, Magog and Madai actually had children, right? Well, then why aren't they listed? Does this mean that the Table of Nations is inaccurate? There are some who say yes, but I believe it's actually the opposite that is true. The fact that these whole ranks of descendants are left out really points to the writer's desperate attempt to be accurate. He only included the ones with which he had knowledge. In other words, he wasn't making any of it up. So while we will undoubtedly find descendants of major blocks of the world's people unexplained, we will, however, find the lines of descendants listed here to be very accurate. Now, the basic divisions of this chapter, chapter 10, is based on the three sons of Noah. And the first one that we're going to cover today is the eldest. His name was Japheth. Let's start in verse 2. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. There's not a whole lot said about the descendants of Japheth. And I think the reason is that they lived in regions that were so far away from the promised land. They didn't have a whole lot of interactions with the Jewish people. And I must remind you, again and again and again, I must remind you, the Old Testament is Jewish. Since they do not largely figure into the Old Testament story, they're just not mentioned much. Now, the reality is that the descendants of Japheth are going to figure prominently into the expansion of the gospel in the New Testament, and they play a rather large role in the closing days of history. We may or may not get to some of that, but you'll see their names in Ezekiel and Revelation. They do play a role. However, with the Hebrew people, not so much. Still, what Moses tells us is very important and of great interest. If for no other reason than this, number 3, look at this. This is important. Japheth is most likely our ancestor, the father of what are called the Indo-European peoples. Now, let's stop for a second and think about that designation, Indo-European. What is meant by that? Indo has to do with India, or the countries to be found in that general direction when moving eastward from the Middle East. Remember, the Middle East, Jerusalem in particular, is the center of the universe as far as a Jew is concerned. And so these people are made up, Japheth's people are made up of people from all the way from the areas of India into the European continent. Now, we don't generally think of those two areas being of the same origin, having a common history. So why are they called the Indo-European peoples? And by the way, if you look at the map here, they cover most of Europe and will go way off the map over there towards Pakistan and India. Why are they called the Indo-European group? Why are Japheth's descendants called that? The answer is probably not what you would expect. Not until the 19th century was it discovered that all of these people come from a common language ancestor. That is why, for example, serious linguistic students will often go to India to study Sanskrit as the closest known language to the original of this entire block of people, of their languages. This Indo-European family of languages is divided into two major groups. You've got the eastern side, off the map over here, which includes Afghanistan, Armenia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, up north in Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, all of those countries that even we would consider east. And then there's also the western division, right? Europe, which includes Greece, Italy, France, England, right? Ireland, Scotland, Belgium, the Netherlands. So, as I said earlier, this relationship of East and West, established by their common language origins, was largely unknown and unsuspected until this technical linguistic work in the 19th century. Yet this is precisely what we find in Genesis in regard to Japheth's descendants. That's what's really cool. As we begin to look at the names and we see where they moved to, it's like, holy cow, that's Indo-European. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. One little cool fact I wanted to share with you before we get into the names. Japheth's name has been preserved in both branches of the Indo European family. Let me give you just two examples. Japheth is probably closer pronounced in Hebrew as Japheth. Okay? So the Greeks, for instance, trace themselves back to Iapetos, Japheth, Iapetos. It's a variant. It comes from the same root. It is referenced in Aristophanes' book, The Clouds. Isn't that interesting? They trace themselves back to Japheth. The Pindar peoples of Pakistan have him in the flood account where he is known as Yapeti. Noah gave Yapeti the land north of the Himalayan mountains. Well, folks, that's exactly where this Indo part of Indo European, those peoples settled. So let's take a look at each of the names. I know that this is making it a little tedious, but man, there's some really cool stuff here if you'll stay with me. Okay, so let's start with Gomer. I got a map here, want to show you how all of this works, where they moved, where they started, and then where they moved to, and why that's a big deal. So you have Gomer here in the Black Sea. That's where they settled, was around the edges of the Black Sea. This is recorded by historians like Herodotus, Strabo, Plutarch. Uh, they settled there, and they gave their names to ancient districts like the Crimea. Now, if you'll remember, the Crimea, this is this little jaunt of land right here below what is today Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are fighting over that territory right now. Well, Crimea comes from the root word for Gomer. They eventually began to expand westward. You'll see the arrow here. They began to go westward into what is now called Europe. They settled in France as the Gauls, in Spain as the Galatia, in Britain as the Celts. All of these names, now we can't see it because we don't read these languages, but they're all variations on the original three consonant name GMR, Gomer. Again, linguistics. Um, and this may seem like a stretch. I'm just trusting the data here. Further, there was a place in the British Isles called Gomerland, which became Cumberland, which became Umbria, which became Ireland. Crazy, right? One commentator writes Gomer's children and his children's children went far up into Europe, where despite their separation both in time and distance, the name of their ancient forebear was preserved among them. So that's Gomer. Now, Gomer had sons. I put them in the light purple. Dark blue is the sons of Japheth. And then we've got the light purple, which are the sons of Gomer. Ashkenaz is a very interesting name. You'll see him right over there under Magog, right? Now, they settled to the north of what is called the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent is this area right here. This is where Israel is. And the Fertile Crescent comes up along the coast here and then runs back down through what we know as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers down to the Persian Gulf. That is called the Fertile Crescent. Well, the Ashkenaz settled to the north of that. This name Ashkenaz is preserved in a lot of places, like a lake that's named Ascanius. There's a people that Homer mentioned called the Ascani. A part of these people may have become the Trojans from the Trojan War. Familiar with that? Because a prince of the royal family of Troy was named Ascanius. Some of these people later moved into Germany, up into the middle part of Europe. We see this in the different denominations of Jews. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they're really not denominations, but there are two major parts of the Jewish people, denominations as it were. The ones who stayed around the Middle East, in Africa, over into the Persian Empire, that area, those are known as Sephardic Jews. But the ones who ended up in Europe, They're known as Ashkenazi Jews. Very interesting. The second offspring of Gomer is Riphath. We really don't have a whole lot about that. Josephus does mention him in his histories of the world, and he says that they are the ancestors of the Paphlagonians. They were in northern Turkey, which is right in this area right here. So there was also some information found that Europe may be derived from the name Riphath. Sounds pretty cool to me. Targuma is almost certainly the ancestor of the ancient Armenians. The Armenians are also known as the House of Targum, way back in some of the histories, like from Josephus and Plutarch. They're mentioned twice in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 27 and in 38. And this word has given us the names of modern day countries like Turkey and Turkestan. So those are the sons of Gomer. Now, let's go back to Japheth's sons. Three names I want to bring up now: Magog, Tubal, and Meshach. You'll see them here on the map. Magog, Tubal, and Meshach. They should all be taken together because, in one way or another, these three brothers ended up being the northern peoples. Think Russia. It's hard to trace the word Magog, though Josephus says that the people of Gog were Scythians, which again are people who settled in the southern part of what is today Russia. They also settled over a little further into the Stans area: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan. You get it, right? So all Russian in origin. On the other hand, it's not hard to trace Meshach and Tubal at all. These names often occur together, obviously showing a close relationship between the peoples bearing those names. Ezekiel does this in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2. Son of man, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the prince chief of Meshach and Tubal. See, they kind of always go together. And prophesy against them and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Now, the early history of the tribes of Meshach and Tubal is found in Herodotus, and he writes that in his day, these peoples lived in the province of Pontus in northern Turkey. Josephus gives them the same location, but says by the time he came along, their names had changed to the Meshan and the Theolabians. I'm not real sure how to say that. That's my best guess. Later, these tribes pushed on north and east of the Black Sea into what is now Russia. These two names, Meshach and Tubal, are preserved in a lot of the names in Russia today. For instance, Moscow and Tobolsk, both large cities in Russia. Meshach, Tubal, Moscow, Tobolsk. Moscow is on the Moshka River, like a variant of Meshach. The Tobolsk is on the Tobol River. Tubal, Tobol. You see all of that? They're all very connected. There are several cities in the area of Moscow and Tobolsk that share the root words of those original names, Meshach and Tubal. I find that very interesting. Now, the next name on the list has to do with the Indo part of Indo-European, and that is the Madai, right over here on the far side of the map. The Madai are what came to be known as the Medes. You know, you've heard of the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, the Medes settled into what is now Persia, and after Persia was conquered, it is said that those peoples pushed further east into the area of Pakistan and India, and that is where they took up residence. So that's the Indo part of Indo-European. Now, of the seven sons of Japheth, More is said about the fourth, Javan, than any other. You'll see him here in the middle of the map. Now, the reason he's mentioned so much is because Javan is the father of the Greeks, right? They settled on the coastline, lots of shipping, trading going on. So the Hebrew people, the Jews, would have been familiar with them. They're mentioned in verse 4. The sons of Javan, let's go here. Here we are. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, in their nations. Now, notice coastland peoples. Greece has got one of the largest coastlines of any country in Europe and Asia. It's because it just has so many nooks and crannies and islands and so forth. And so Javan is where the Greeks settled. Um, Also, Elisha, however you say that, he is given by Homer, the poet. Uh, his name was changed to the Elysians, which settled in the area of, uh, of northern Greece. Tarshish is a city that's mentioned in is a group that's mentioned in the book of Jonah. Remember, Jonah was running away from Nineveh and ended up in Tarshish. Well, where's Tarshish? We're pretty sure that that is Spain, identified by Tartessos, a city that is there. And again, part of the coastland peoples makes a lot of sense. Kittim is a people group that settled on the little island of Cyprus. And Dodanim, also in the green, down here. Um, some of the manuscripts have them as the Rodanim, and they settled on the island of Rhodes. Rodanim, Rhodes. Now, the Rhone River is probably named after the Rodanim, some of whom probably settled around the mouth of that particular river. The last of Japheth's sons is Tyrus. You'll see him here. According to Josephus, he is the ancestor of the Thracians and perhaps even the Etruscans, which became the Italians, which became the Roman Empire. An extraordinary thing here, excuse me. So there it is. Now, what does all of that mean? The interesting thing about this expansion of the Indo-European peoples, the descendants of Japheth, in addition to the accuracy of the names given in Genesis, is that it is a precise fulfillment of the prophecy made concerning Japheth by Noah in the preceding chapter. Let me show you what I mean. This is what Noah said to Japheth. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Folks, this is exactly what happened. God enlarged the territory of Japheth to include the whole of Europe and even large parts of Asia. I mean, think of Russia today, right? Moreover, if the expansion of the nations proceeded as most anthropologists believe, from northeastern Russia, Japheth's people crossed the Bering Strait into Alaska, down into Canada, down into the rest of North America, and even down into South America. This family of nations eventually possessed most of the world's territory. But as they moved away from the center of where God, the Most High, was revealed through the Israelite people, and of course, the birth of Jesus in the Middle East, these Indo-European peoples gained the whole world, but at a very great cost. Abandoning the one true God, the descendants of Japheth followed after other gods, like what's reported in Romans chapter 1. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of a mortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Folks, the descendants of Japheth were a pagan bunch. Um, the ancient Europeans were known as barbarians. Remember, the Romans fought the barbarian German tribes. Remember your world history? Man, they were awful. The Romans themselves were a godless, awful people. Just some of the worst atrocities that have been committed in the history of the world were committed by the Indo European people, the descendants of Japheth. Yes, God enlarged them, but they were a mess. However, there was a change from their dark ways. And it came because, look in verse 9 again, verse 29, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, guess who the descendants of Shem were? You might know them: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Jesus. And I would remind you in your world history that when the God of Shem, the true and living God, brought to us his son Jesus, of the three major people groups, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, where did the gospel spread the fastest? Folks, it was among Japheth's people, the Indo European people. Think of how the gospel spread across Europe, Russia. Now, don't think communist Russia, think Orthodox Christian Russia before the revolution. The Judeo Christian God was received most heartily by these godless peoples of Japheth. You see, folks, Japheth came to dwell in the tents of Shem through Jesus. God blessed them because of it. And folks, they continue to grow. They expanded and enlarged their territory, again, even to the point of settling North and South America, where the gospel spread like wildfire. He enlarged them, and now they dwell in the tents of Shem through Jesus. It is absolutely remarkable how accurate the Bible is. All praise and glory to Him. Thanks for listening.